The reading today is from Luke 24, verses 44 through 53. Jesus said to them, "These are my words that I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law from Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms must be fulfilled." Then he opened their minds to understand the scriptures. And he said to them, "This is what is written. The Christ will suffer and rise from the dead on the third day, and a change of heart and life for the forgiveness of sins must be preached in his name to all nations, beginning from Jerusalem. You are the witnesses of these things. Look, I'm sending you what my Father promised, but you are to stay in the city until you have been furnished with the heavenly power." He led them out as far as Bethany, where he lifted his hands and blessed them. As he blessed them, he left them and was taken up to heaven. They worshiped him and returned to Jerusalem, overwhelmed with joy, and they were continuously in the temple praising God. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
This is one of those days when I look out across our worship space and I think, boy, maybe we ought to just address the elephant in the room today. You've probably figured out what it is. A couple of pews are empty that maybe we're not used to being empty, maybe feels a little sparse, a little more spacious. Frankly, that's probably good, as warm as it is this weekend. We can spread out and not overheat today, but we know the flip side of that is it's a 3-day weekend, it's warm, it's sunny. The confluence of those three things in Washington State is apparently quite rare. I am learning these things slowly but surely. So we know that there are people out. It is Memorial Day weekend, but for me, the elephant in the room is not so much who's here and who isn't. I mean, sure, if you want to pat yourselves on the back, feel free, like they're going to know. But to me, the elephant in the room is that on this Memorial Day weekend, from a preaching perspective, sometimes we can feel trapped between the pull of Memorial Day and the pull of the church. For those of my preachers in the room know, and many of you probably do as well, Memorial Day is a national holiday, but it doesn't fall on any of our church calendars, at least not officially. Today is actually Ascension Sunday, the Sunday prior to Pentecost. So the elephant in the room becomes, what do you do then with the civil holiday that coincides today in this year with our religious holiday? And how do you deal with that when you run the risk as a preacher of pulling a civil religion into the pulpit that maybe doesn't belong here? And how do you honor the service of those who have taken up arms in the service of the nation without bringing a level of militarization to the gospel that really doesn't necessarily belong there? These things can start to blur the lines between our nation and our faith in ways that can, well, you've heard me say it before, they can become very unhealthy for us, for our nation, for our church, for one another. It's something that we have to struggle with. And one of these days, I'm actually going to draw on the wisdom of all these preachers I've got in the audience and say, what did you guys do? Now that you don't have to do it anymore, tell me your secrets. But this week, I never got around to it, so I find myself struggling with that elephant that's in the room. But even if we can set the civil holiday aside and get back to our scriptures and our Ascension Sunday, I have a scriptural elephant in the room as well. As I was looking at our story for today, I thought, what in heaven's name do we do with the Ascension story? A little known secret, in all my years of preaching, I don't think I've ever actually preached this text. And it's because every time I came around to the selection, I looked at it and I said, well, this is a wonderful story, but what am I going to do with it? What is it going to say? I mean, think about it. In Luke's story, and the going scholarship has been that the author of Luke's gospel also wrote the book of Acts. And we know that Pentecost comes up very quickly in the book of Acts there in chapter 2. And we know that Pentecost Sunday is next week. You're invited to wear red to make that a festive occasion in the life of the church. So this Ascension text, in a way, is just kind of a setup. It's a softball that's tossed out there so we can bat our way around to Pentecost next week. So what do you do with a story that looks like it's really pointing toward the next story? And I can't preach that story till next week because then I won't have anything to preach next week. And it's a little dicey anyway. Luke's story of Jesus' ascension, you won't find it in Matthew's gospel. It ends without an ascension. And the same story in John. The last thing we hear of John, he meets Peter and some of the other disciples along the beach. And that's the end of John's gospel. Mark's gospel has a story that's similar to what we heard today, but there's a lot of debate as to whether that was in the original version of Mark or whether somebody added it later because they'd read Luke's and they thought Mark's needed to have it as well. So however it got there, it didn't. We don't hear this story shared across all of our gospels, so it creates a bit of a problem for preachers as well. What do we do with this? We don't want to blur all of our gospels together, as one of my New Testament professors called it, the mush gospel, that you get when you take all the stories from every one of them, you put them together and you say, this is Jesus. Because he would always turn around and say, no, we have John's story of Jesus, and we have Luke's story of Jesus, and Matthew's, and Mark's, and there were others that didn't make it into the Bible, and we hear Paul's story of Jesus in his letters that he wrote, and Peter's as well. But we like to mush gospel, and I don't want to get too close to blurring those lines there. And yet, I don't know how on Memorial Day weekend we don't blur the lines a little bit. And I'm going to risk that blurring as I share the closest thing that I have to a war story. The closest I ever got. In my 2 years in the National Guard, I was a non-deployable asset. Maybe a pain in the asset to some of my colleagues, but as a chaplain candidate, we were not eligible to be called up and deployed. The longest active orders we could be put on was your annual training during the summer. I did 2 weeks of annual training, and ironically, the way things shook out, I never attended my chaplain basic course before that all ended. Long story, ask me offline sometime. So I was never in a position where, in a time of emergency, I was most likely not going to be activated if they needed help after a natural disaster. I was definitely not going to be called up, should part of the Oklahoma National Guard be deployed into a combat deployment situation. However, it didn't prevent me from finding myself in a position where I was supporting the deployment of others. So one of my drill weekends, and it was either August or September of 2006, some of the units from the Oklahoma National Guard were being activated, and they were going to deploy to Afghanistan alongside some members of, I believe, the Oregon National Guard as part of a training mission to help train the Afghan Defense Forces and the Afghan National Police. And the workup for this, if you've not been in a reserve unit, the workup is actually quite extensive. It begins right there at home in your home state, and you go through all kinds of checks. You make sure all of your T's are crossed, your I's are dotted. If your teeth are a little bit out of whack, you get your teeth looked at and taken care of right there. You get everything in line, and then they will deploy you to one of the, they'll issue you orders to one of the Army installations around the country where you will meet up with the entire unit you're preparing to deploy with. You'll do some training, you'll do some workup. I believe that they may have actually been coming to Fort Lewis before their deployment to Afghanistan. But we were working through the initial protocols of making sure everybody's paperwork is in order, everybody has things in line. And for the chaplains, that meant we had to do one thing. We set up our booth in the big gymnasium hall, and as people went around to the different stations taking care of all their needs, they would come to the chaplain's booth, and we would ask them, can you give me your full name? And then your religious affiliation. We just need to check and make sure it's correct. So they'd share their name and whatever church or faith group they were with. This sounds minuscule and trivial, but you would be amazed at the number of people who were in the wrong church and occasionally a couple of people who were in the wrong faith. That's military record keeping for you. So our job was to make any corrections on this and then ask them if there was anything they needed to speak with the chaplain about, because if there was, we would take their name, we would pass it along to our boss, who was the state chaplain, and then he would make sure one of the active chaplains contacted these folks. The most exciting aspect of my not quite but almost as close as I'm going to get to war duty was I did correct a couple of people who were listed as being in the wrong church, who looked just as surprised as I was to see that a Southern Baptist was listed as being an Episcopalian. I don't know how you make that mistake, but that's the Army for you. But I remember watching as these members of the Guard came through my station as I sat there checking names against lists and updating information and asking them if there's anything they needed to talk to a chaplain about. And I remember thinking in 2006, I was a decade younger than I am now. And I remembered looking at some of the people who came through my station and thinking, wow, these kids are really young. We have guys who've just barely gotten out of high school, barely gotten through their basic training, and they're coming to my station to check up on their religious information because they're about to go to war. Wow. This all takes place in Oklahoma City, and so normally I would go to Oklahoma City for the weekend and I would stay. And they have a nice Guard facility there that's really cheap. You can't beat the price at $10 a night. So I would stay in this facility, and it's not that the sleep there was great anyway, since the drywall was wallpaper thin and you could always hear people up and moving about. So I never slept well anyway. But I remember that night, I hardly slept at all. There was something hard about looking kids in the eye and preparing to send them to war. And yet they were calm, they were collected. I think they did better with it than I did, and I wasn't even the one going to war. They were prepared. They were just taking care of some of the last checks. They'd go do their workup here at Fort Lewis, and they would go. For the young guys, it was their first time. I never saw them waver. For some of the older guys who had done it before, I could tell that they weren't alarmed. They were ready. They had made their peace with what they were doing and where they were going. I sure hadn't. I'm still not sure that I have yet. But I remember being amazed at their ability to step into this role, to move out of becoming a citizen soldier and to begin the process of becoming a soldier. And they handled it with such grace. They handled it with such fortitude. There are days when I think it was probably good I never was in a position to deploy. I don't know that I was as ready as those guys were. They had heard their country's call and they rose to the occasion. They knew what they were going to do. Now you got to flip that story on its ear a little bit to get back to the scriptures at all in this. Because as I was preparing for this week, that's where my mind kept going. And it took me for a while to see whether there was any linkage, even a tenuous one, that would bring me to that place. And I realized there's some similarity to Jesus there with the disciples for that one last time. There's some similarity to that pre-deployment check-in, going through those last protocols of preparation. He gave them that pep talk, that reminder of this is what scriptures have been pointing to. This is what we have been preparing for. And now it's your turn. Go into the city. Await the arrival of the Spirit. And when it comes, you'll know what to do. All they had to do was check in, hear the words, and off Jesus goes. It's easy to get caught up in the miracle of Jesus beginning to float up from the ground and literally ascending to the heavens. In fact, that's probably the reason that I've avoided preaching it for so many years. I didn't want to deal with the miracle, and I didn't know what the value of the miracle was. And it's taken me a long time to realize that aside from another display of God's power, whether we needed another one or not, the point wasn't to show off God's power. The point was to show the disciples who were there that now God's power was in their hands and the ball was in their court. They were stepping out on their own. They were deploying into action in Christ's name, and they were going to do the work of the gospel. They weren't going to have Jesus there to pick them up when they stumbled. They were not going to have Jesus there to speak and to preach on their behalf. It was time for them to take up the gospel and own it and embody it and preach it for themselves. And the last thing he had to do was give them the opportunity. Go into the city. Await the Spirit, because you guys are ready. The Spirit will come. The power of God will move amongst you, and you will move out into the world and do amazing and wonderful things in my name. The part he didn't say was, you'll do it without me there. I often forget, with next Sunday being Pentecost, yes, we celebrate the arrival of the Spirit, and we get so caught up in that. I often forget this was the first great act of the disciples post-Jesus. This was the first great thing they had done since his ascension, since his departure from them. This is the first thing they were doing on their own. Jesus had taken the training wheels off and sent them into the city, and it was amazing. And I think God is calling us in stories like this to put away the training wheels, to not lean too heavily on whether Jesus is with us or not, but to go and to do, because that is our call. It is time for us to rise to the occasion, to ascend to our own calling, and to be the church that God needs us to be for today, and then to prepare ourselves to keep walking forward and grow into the church that God will need us to be tomorrow. I can't go too far down that road because then I won't have anything to say next week. But I take comfort in the fact that today's story is a story about Jesus reminding us that he believes in us. We get fixated on how much we believe in him. Do we remember that he believes in us? That we have been equipping ourselves, that we have been preparing ourselves, and we have work to do. And he's going to step out of the way and let us go out and do it. So come back next week. We'll have another pep talk. We will look and listen for the Spirit, and we will see what the first steps are for us to begin to go down that road that God is calling us to and that Jesus has entrusted us to travel. So let's be prepared to ascend to our calling. So I'm pretty sure God has some work for us to do. Amen.